In this strident political atmosphere, bipartisan support is rare, but the risk of mega wildfires has created it. We will explore that and what city folks, especially those in the East, need to understand about wildfires and living next to public lands. That and much more on this edition of Just Saying. Hello there, and thank you for joining me. I'm Allison Cardivold. As promised, this is the episode about wildfires. I first did the research on this about 2 months ago. Then things started happening, things changed, we got distracted, but we're coming back to it because I said that we would. So here we are in mid-October. As D.C. implodes over politics and the East Coast is battered by hurricanes like Michael, wildfires in our western states are still raging, and now they go largely underreported. Fire season is supposed to be over after all, right? Well, the total number of acres already burned this year is over 8 million. And there are around 30 large fires still burning in 10 western states right now, including one mega fire in Oregon. If you don't know, the definition of mega fire is a fire that burns more than 100,000 acres. It's really rather hard to comprehend. So here's the gist. There are 5 major points that I'm going to touch on in this podcast. 1, how our forests have been managed for the past several decades isn't working. 2, it doesn't matter what you think about climate change, we can't change the weather fast enough to save our forests. 3, if you've never lived next to public lands, it's hard to appreciate the impact it has on those who do live there. 4, left to nature's own devices, the outcome will continue to be catastrophic for the West. And 5, a plan to change forest management is now in place, but our thinking needs to change as well. So there you have it. Those are the 5 points we're really going to touch on today. If you'd like to follow along in a written form, you can always go to the website, justsaying.com, GISTSAYN.com. There you will find a corresponding article that has the information that I'm talking about, plus links to where I got this information. So you can follow along that way if you are not out running or enjoying yourself in some other fashion. All right, so let's begin with the bipartisan support for this new plan. Back in August, the Department of Agriculture announced a new strategy for the United States Forest Service. It is hoped that this new strategy will mitigate the impact that catastrophic wildfires, invasive species, insect and disease epidemics, and droughts are currently having on the nation's forests. The stewardship plan rolled out on August 16th, and it was deemed historic for its new approach to have the U.S. Forest Service develop greater partnerships with both public and private landowners. It also has bipartisan support from Western senators. At the announcement of the new plan in D.C., kind of a low-key press conference was held. Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, said, quote, "These are not your grandfather's fires. They are bigger, they are hotter, they are more powerful. Last year, we had one fire leap the Columbia River, which was unheard of because rivers, in effect, are fire breaks. So it's really important that we stake out some new ground here," unquote. One reason he and his Washington state counterpart, Senator Maria Cantwell, are willing to work with the Trump administration on this is because even their constituents in urban areas are now feeling the effects from these wildfires. The traditionally beautiful blue summer skies of the Northwest are now often blotted out by smoke. I had relatives traveling clear across the western states this summer, and I got pictures from them. that you couldn't even see blue anywhere you were. My sister drove from the time she hit Nevada going up through Idaho. It was just brown sky everywhere. And when you're going out there to enjoy the outdoors and you're trapped inside, it really starts to have an impact on the way people think about these wildfires. Senator Wyden also said, quote, "In the West, we are creating clean air refugees who are traipsing from place to place just trying to find breathable air." He went on to say, quote, "That is what we are seeing today, a real game plan for reducing the 80 million acres of hazardous fuel that constitutes the backlog on Forest Service lands. That is what this is all about," unquote. At the unveiling press conference, Democratic Senator Cantwell said, quote, "We are here today because a few months ago, the U.S. Congress gave the Secretary of Agriculture and the Forest Service new tools to help fight fires. The advent of that has now been that they have come up with a new vision of how they are implementing those tools, and it couldn't come at a more important time. We've lost tens of thousands of homes in just the last year, and wildfires have killed 43 people. So we needed the new tools, and we certainly need the new vision, and we need further cooperation by all entities," unquote. According to Cantwell, we are spending more than $2 billion a year on fire suppression. Just last year in Washington state, she says the Colville tribe lost more than $2 billion worth of its timber on its tribal lands to wildfires. Republican Senator Steve Daines agrees. His state of Montana lost 1.4 million acres of forest to fires last year, and hundreds of thousands already this year. Daines said he is excited that U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, understands that the people who live out west should have a greater say about what needs to be done when it comes to forest management in their area. Senator Daines said, quote, "We will never eliminate the risk of wildfire, but we can reduce that risk, and we can reduce that severity through better proactive timber management techniques. As we say out in Montana, either we are going to manage our forests or our forests are going to manage us. And right now, out in the West, the forests are managing us," unquote. In D.C.'s current climate, it is unusual for senators to agree on anything across party lines. For decades, people living in the East have impacted the environment, both political and actual, that people in the West have to live in. However, they haven't had to, as the saying goes, eat their own dog food. By that, I mean they can demand to leave the forest untouched, and when things go wrong, they don't have to live with the daily reality of that. It's taken several decades, but people in Western cities who once thought the same way are now starting to feel some impact. As I said, the beautiful blue skies get blotted out, residents breathe smoke all summer long, and the costs are rising. People on the East Coast don't have to deal with those consequences, but they do have to help pay the ever-increasing bill. The reason these senators can be part of a bipartisan effort now is because whether you believe the trend of long, hot summers is a natural cycle or caused by man, the fact is it translates into longer fire seasons and more severe fire seasons. Right now, the people in the West, they don't care why the fire seasons are longer. They just want relief. And that's why arguing about climate change is not going to help the forests. Even if everyone agreed that man-made CO2 emissions are the cause of all climate change, the United States cannot change the trend fast enough to keep the West from burning. The International Energy Agency reports that last year, global energy-related carbon emissions rose to a historic high. The IEA, as it's called, says Asian countries are accountable for 2/3 of the global increase in emissions. Most major economies saw an increase, but China's emissions rose the most, with a 1.7% increase. Britain, Mexico, Japan, and the United States were the only major economies that experienced declines in their carbon emissions in 2017. According to the IEA, the biggest drop came from the United States, but its 0.5% reduction did not even offset China's increase, let alone the rest of the countries that had increased emissions as well. The argument that we can save our forests by preventing climate change is at best a pipe dream. Even if the United States were to implement more stringent emission standards, it would not be enough to counter what is happening in China or India alone. Waiting for these countries to lower their emissions in the hopes that it will decrease the warming trends currently being experienced in our Western summers is foolish. We can't wait for that. We have to do other things now. Doesn't mean you can't work on that, but we can't just say we're going to wait and have man-made climate change diminished. We just can't wait for that. So, if we can't cool the weather, what can we do? There's actually a lot. But first, we need to understand the history. This crisis has been decades in the making. Just 5 years after the creation of the Forest Service, a catastrophic blaze, the largest in U.S. history, rolled through Idaho and western Montana. It was in 1910. And in 1910, a forest the size of Connecticut exploded in flames. With fire and oxygen, it generated its own tornadoes. 3 million acres burned in just 2 days. Entire towns were laid waste, and at least 85 people were killed. In describing it, one survivor said it was like, quote, the sound of 1,000 trains rushing over 1,000 steel trestles, unquote. Another compared it to the roar of Niagara Falls. A correspondent from the Spokesman Review filing from Wardner, Idaho wrote, quote, not a living thing can be seen for a distance of 20 miles. Not a green spot greets the eye, where a week before stood one of the finest bodies of white pine timber in the world. He went on to say, the completeness of the destruction is indescribable. Then added, even the fishes in the streams were killed and are seen floating on the water by the thousands, unquote. After this inferno, a policy developed to try and snuff out every fire within 48 hours. You can understand this knee-jerk reaction. But the fact is, complete fire suppression goes against the natural order of evergreen forests in the West. Their fire is a vital part of its rejuvenation process. Yet at first, things were kept somewhat imbalanced because there was also a lot of logging taking place on public lands that created open space and removed excess fuel, something that the fires did naturally. Then in the late 80s, environmental groups took issue with the unsightly patchwork of logging and clear cuts and the logging roads that crisscrossed the western landscape. Many of their concerns were valid. Not enough attention was being placed on watershed protection, erosion prevention, and the balance of wildlife habitat. For example, the practice of skidding logs up creek beds just because it was the path of least resistance was harmful. Shouldn't have been done. But at that point, environmentalists were having a difficult time kind of getting their movement going. So they found an adorable but elusive mascot that could swing the pendulum back to the way they thought the forest should be used. The northern spotted owl was that mascot, and it was used to weaponize the Endangered Species Act. I believe it was the president of the Sierra Club at the time who said, if we hadn't found the spotted owl, we would have had to create him. That's how important it was. to get their movement really going. So from there, it was a constant battle between those who wanted to lock up all public lands and look at them from afar, and those who were trying to make a living off of those public lands. By the mid-90s, environmental organizations were on a roll, but it was at the expense of tens of thousands of rural Americans who lost their jobs and their way of life. Honestly, this is something they have not forgotten. The fact that someone on the East Coast could send a single letter and delay or completely block a timber sale that had been in the planning stages for years was something that frustrated not only private citizens, but public servants. Almost 30 years ago, the first documentary I ever did was called Timber, A Question of Balance. Some things don't change, right? This was right when the environmental movement had really picked up momentum by using, as I said, the Endangered Species Act and the spotted owl to shut down logging on public lands in Washington and Oregon, especially the old growth areas. That's where it started. It was marketed as an effort to save the owls. Unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out that way. In fact, the spotted owls, are now being threatened by another species of owl. But it did really help the environmental movement. For that documentary, I interviewed the supervisor of the Clearwater National Forest. His name was Ed Schultz. After the interview, he shared some of his frustrations in running a national forest with me. I remember him showing me a book that was about as thick as a Bible. He explained that it contained all the rules he had to follow in order to plan out the use of the national forest. He told me it took his people years to plan out each timber sale because they first had to look at what impact it would have on the watershed and various other environmental issues that they should be looking at. But once they decided how much of an area could be logged and how it should be logged, they had to put a plan in place. And this is where the problem came in. That plan, at least at that time, could be completely interrupted with one letter sent in protest of the sale. Now, mind you, the person sending the letter could be living anywhere in the country. They could be on the East Coast. They didn't need to have any knowledge or experience about the forest. In fact, they might never have been in Idaho in their lives. And yet their protest could derail years of work by people who went to college to study this and spent every day working in the environment in question. Back then, he found this extremely frustrating, and he told me that we are setting ourselves up for disaster. He said he was being prevented from managing the forest in a way that would keep it healthy. He was blocked from taking dead and dying timber off the forest. He couldn't clear out bug infestations, for example, which caused more dead and dying trees. And he couldn't thin things out the way he thought was best. He said instead, in an effort to placate environmentalists and the shifting attitude coming out of Washington, D.C., the Forest Service began approving fewer and fewer timber sales and started closing down logging roads. These roads were also used to fight fires. The belief that this was the best way to manage the forest was not yet shared by people working on the ground. Those people came later, after people like Ed Schultz either retired or were transferred to other places. I have always remembered the prediction he made, that the decisions being made then were setting our forests up for future disaster. He said the time will come when after a wet spring, there will be lots of early growth, followed by a hot, dry summer where the winds pick up. Somewhere, a spark will ignite, and the Northwest will go up like a tinderbox. He told me it will be like the fire of 1910. He was right. He totally predicted the mega fires we see today. As I mentioned before, mega fires burn at least 100,000 acres. This year, in just the Carr Fire, more than 1,000 homes were destroyed. According to one insurance analysis company, more than 4.5 million homes in the United States are at risk of being destroyed by wildfires. That's a lot of homes. That's a lot of people across a huge area. Despite this, it's important to remember that not all fire is the enemy. It is a natural part of a healthy forest life cycle. It's meant to burn in the understory and clean out all the grass and fuels there, dead leaves, branches, and whatnot. A healthy, mature forest can survive small wildfires. Understories burn, and even patches of the overstory are taken out in sections, and that creates future meadows and natural fire breaks, so when the next fire comes along, it doesn't burn too hot. The trouble is, we've screwed it all up. First, we started suppressing fires. Then we stopped logging. If we are not going to let fires take out the excess fuel in the forest, then we need to do it. But we didn't. Compared to 150 years ago, it's all out of whack. Paul Hesburgh is a research landscape ecologist for the U.S. Forest Service, and he did a great TED Talk on this. In it, he says, a future without smoke and fire is not on the table. He says we have actually been so good at replanting our forests and suppressing fires that we now have what he describes as an epidemic of trees. I have embedded his TED Talk on the website, which does an excellent job of showing the natural role fires play in keeping a forest healthy. Hesburgh explains that part of the problem we now face is that there have been decades of the continuous buildup of extra fuel in the forest. Millions upon millions of trees are tightly packed and overgrown with underbrush. There are very few to no meadows which act as natural fire breaks. That used to be created by fires and by those ugly clear cuts we didn't like. These open spaces also provide animals places to graze and live on the edges of. You couple these conditions with the heavy snowfall winters followed by hot, dry summers, and you have an incubator for catastrophic fires. Add a spark and wind, and there is little firefighters can do but watch them burn. The only way to stop catastrophic wildfires at this point is to destroy that incubator before there's ever a spark. Efforts must be made to manage the land so that these conditions don't exist in the first place. Prescribed thinning, burning, and logging removes tightly packed trees, dead and dying trees, and restores a forest's health. These activities can also provide good-paying jobs for residents in states that have been relegated for at least the past several decades to being the rest of the country's recreational playgrounds. That's part of the hazard of living with public land. In order to save the West, there are a few things the East needs to understand. First is that most native Westerners resent the fact that their lives can be so greatly impacted by outside influences. They believe locking up public land has proven ineffective and places a disproportionate burden on people who live in Western states. This has to do with both perception and reality. It is difficult for people in the eastern United States to fully appreciate what it's like to live somewhere surrounded by public land. I know this because I have lived both places and talked to people about this in both places. If you live in the West, on the one hand, it's great that you have beautiful open areas to recreate in. Yet on the other hand, it can make it really hard to make a living. The federal government has always owned lots of land. Right now, it owns about 20%, or 640 million acres out of the 2.27 billion acres that make up the United States. Land disposal used to be used to encourage settlement. It really wasn't until the 20th century that the emphasis shifted to retention. As a result, the federal government owns 61.3% of Alaska and 46.4% of the 11 most western contiguous states. In contrast, the federal government only owns 4.2% of the land in the rest of the country. In the East Coast, it had already sold off most of its holdings before that shift, and in the early 20th century when they said, okay, we're now going to keep it all. To put this into perspective, let's look at just one of those western states. I'm going to choose Idaho because that's where I grew up, and it's a good example. In Idaho, there are 34.5 million acres of public land. It's a pretty big state. It's not the biggest, but more than 70% of its land is unavailable for any type of private ownership, and the use that is allowed is very limited on those public lands. 9% of it is designated as wilderness area, meaning it is off limits to any type of mining, logging, or grazing. You can't drive through it. You can't even ride a bicycle through it because nothing motorized or mechanized is allowed on that 4.8 million acres. You can't even use a chainsaw to fight fires on it. You might think that's great, but again, let's try to put this into perspective. If you laid out all the public land in Idaho over the east, it would cover the entire states of Pennsylvania and New Jersey with 1 million acres to spare. This means you could also throw in New York City, all 5 boroughs, because that is just over 70,000 acres. So you would still have 30,000 acres left over. Just the acres designated as wilderness would cover the entire state of New Jersey. Can you imagine that? Saying, all right, everyone in New Jersey has to get out. No roads, no jobs, no houses, no motorcycles, no bikes. You can ride a horse or you can walk through it, but that's it. In Pennsylvania, that would be public lands that aren't wilderness, but they're still restricted. So you could have some roads, you can travel through it, you can recreate there, ride your motorcycles or your snowmobiles, but you cannot live there, and you most certainly cannot have a business there. This would go for New York as well. You'd have to say everyone has got to go somewhere else. Each and every one of the 9 million people in New York City would have to get out. Wall Street, gone. The United Nations, get out. Somewhere else. The entire island of Manhattan would need to look more or less like Central Park, or even more rural than that. Oh, but the people in other states would get to decide that for sure, as they would also determine what kind of access would be given to all the lands in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Yeah, I don't think it would go over very well at all. Keep in mind, these are the numbers related to just one western state. There are 10 more, plus Alaska, with very similar scenarios. If you can wrap your head around that, then you can start to understand how people in Idaho feel when people on the East Coast want to dictate how they live. Oh, and I forgot to mention, let's drop a bunch of wolves into the middle of Pennsylvania and New Jersey and just watch and see where they end up. My gosh, the people around Cleveland freak out if they see a coyote. I can't even imagine what they would do once wolves started loping through their backyards, because they don't stay where they get dropped. They multiply very quickly, and a decade or so in, their territories grow exponentially. A lot of times you will hear that people should know better than to build in areas prone to wildfires. Well, When more than 70% of all land in the state is owned by one public entity or another, you aren't left with many options. That's a bit like telling coastal states that no one should build anywhere along coastlines. A lot of these lands, these public lands, are patchworked around private lands, or state lands. And if you did that, you'd eliminate almost everywhere that people could live. So it's really not fair to say, oh, you shouldn't build there because it's too close. Because now not only are you saying, oh, we've got 70% locked up in public lands, but you can't even build on the private lands around it. That's setting up a pretty impossible scenario to live with. I know New York is incredible, and DC is wonderful, and Boston is awesome. And it's really hard to believe that there is anyone who would not want to live in these fantastic metropolitan areas. But trust me, there are people who don't. They don't want to live there. They have zero desire to live with you, and you should be thankful for that. These people want to see the great outdoors every day. That's why they live where they do. And that's why, left to their own devices, they are pretty good stewards of the land around them. They don't want to destroy that place that you might go to someday on a 1-week trip. They are there every day, and they have to live with the realities of that. Maybe, just maybe, we could trust them a bit more with the day-to-day decisions about these public lands that they must live around. Right now, it's costing us $2 billion a year at least to fight fires. Last year, it was almost $3 billion. And hundreds of millions of acres of timber have been devastated. Now that tens of thousands of houses have been destroyed as well, and people are trapped in their homes because of the smoke, it seems lawmakers and people living in urban areas are finally ready to talk about doing something different. We have tried locking up the land and doing nothing with it. But why should we pay to watch something burn when we could actually be making money to have a fraction of that area damaged by wildfires managed by state and local entities? Timber sales can make money. That money can be used to pay for the people who manage the forest. It also creates jobs for people who actually live there. It should be a pretty self-sustaining operation. You don't go back to the old ways of mismanagement, of overlogging. Don't let the pendulum swing that far back. For once, we could try and stop it in the middle. It's the same concept as having the conservation programs in states paid by the people who hunt and fish. Their tags, stamps, and licenses all support conservation programs. That's a good thing. What is the point of locking up hundreds of millions of acres only to pay $2 billion a year to watch it burn? It's crazy. Log part of it, open up those forests, make them healthy. Give them back the mosaic look that they had 150 years ago so that when the fires do burn, they don't burn at such intense levels. But hey, you can agree or disagree, because I'm just saying. That's it for now. Until next time, please be sure to follow the podcast and our related social media accounts. Take care.